Hey folks, I'm talking to the internet here. Sorry, folks. Our regular live stream system, we're having all kinds of issues. So I'm doing it on my phone like I did in church a couple of weeks ago. So it'll be not quite as sharp or good, but hopefully it'll be fine. And we'll post a better version of it tomorrow. But if you want to watch live, we're going to be live in about 2 or 3 minutes. So appreciate you tuning in and watching us as we get ready to talk about Samson here in 2 or 3 minutes. So hopefully it'll come through. We've been having internet issues all day. So anyway, hopefully it'll be all right. We'll see you all in just a couple minutes. And you heard what I said to them. We are having issues today with internet, which technology I love when it works. And when it works, it's wonderful. And we've been having lots of internet issues for a while, and we're actually improving things in the long run in terms of our Wi-Fi in the building. It's going to be better, but for them to move things around and change cords and put in different hotspots and blah, 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 they're doing a lot of that stuff. And the turnover is of course spotty as they're in the middle of switching things and moving cords around, and they're doing all that. And if you went into the room, which is back here where all the mainframe stuff is, and this is way over my head of understanding, but where the master stuff is that controls internet, I mean, it looks, the wires are like, to me it looks like just a twisted mess of everything, and they're going to hopefully make that less of a twisted mess of everything. I think it's been added to and taken away from and messed with over the years, and every time they've done something, it's gotten more, tangly, and hopefully it'll be nice and smooth. But anytime you try to improve something, it's going to be down for a day or so in between, and today's the day. So anyway, because of course it's better today than Sunday, of course. So anyway, but so folks online, hopefully. We're at least coming in, it says we're coming in live. So I've got still a minute or two to go. As I say, ever since we went to daylight savings, we're in daylight savings, aren't we? Or are we out of it? Huh? We're out of it. Okay, we're back to... Okay, God's time. We're back to standard time, yeah. Well, standard time is pretty darn dark at 6 o'clock, isn't it? It's pretty dark at 5:30, but at least it's not as dark when you wake up. So it's still dark, and of course, those winter solstice in about a month is the darkest day of the year, the least sunlight of the year. 21st. I think it's usually around December 21st is the winter solstice, yeah, which is the least amount of sunlight, and then of course the summer solstice is the most amount of sunlight. And with the winter solstice, we have the most starlight. That makes sense. The darker it is, the more you can see the stars. That's right. Wow. Today's my birthday, and thank you. Yes, and so thank you. Yeah. So one of those somewhat milestone birthdays for me. I'll give you a clue. I went on Medicare this month, so that tells you what birthday it is, huh?
Welcome to the club.
Yeah. And maybe now I'll stop getting things in the mail every single day about Medicare. For about the last 6 months at least, it's every day. 2 or 3 flyers, it feels like every single day about some Medicare plan. And I finally picked one, and I thought, now that I'm officially on it, because you go on it the first day of the month you turn, so I went on it November 1st, so I thought maybe it'll stop, but yeah, hadn't stopped so far. Yeah, I'm having to learn about that stuff. I knew a little bit about it because of Janine's mom, and I had to deal with some of it for her, but now it's for me. So anyway, I want to say it's about 6 o'clock, so or a little after. So welcome officially in the sanctuary online. I'm going to talk tonight about Samson, and tomorrow and next Wednesday, about Gideon, because they're both fascinating stories that take place in the book of Judges. But before I go into Samson's story, just to remind us where the judges fall in all of this. In the book of Judges, which the name Judges, the book of Judges, in some ways is a name that's confusing to us, because when we hear the word judge, of course, we think of our modern system. We think of somebody in a courtroom, in a black robe, with a gavel, dealing with a trial, or that's what we think of when it's talking about a judge. In the Old Testament, that's not what the judges are. They are not leading court cases. The place of the judges falls in terms of Old Testament history. And remember, the books of the Old Testament are not in chronological order, so you jump around some. But think about it this way. We have the Exodus. Okay? We have the children of Israel coming out of slavery and bondage in Egypt. We have them traveling for a few weeks to go from the land of Goshen in Egypt to the east side of the Jordan River. If you remember in the books that they then send spies across the Jordan to spy out the area of what we call Palestine or Canaan, the land of Canaan. They send 12 spies, one from every tribe of the 12 tribes. And if you remember, they come back with a majority report and a minority report. 10 of the 12 say the land is occupied by very fierce people, walled cities, they're giants, they're ferocious. There's no way we'll ever take this land. We're like grasshoppers next to them. There's no way we'll ever occupy this land. That's 10 out of the 12's report. And then 2 of the 12, Caleb and Joshua, say, if God says he's going to give it to us, he's going to give it to us. So we need to have trust and faith that if God promised us this land, it's our land. Well, of course, they go with the 10, and because of that, they wander for 40 years. It's because of that lack of trust that they wander in the desert for 40 years. It doesn't take 40 years to go from Egypt to Canaan. It takes maybe 2 or 3 weeks traveling on foot. The reason they wander in the desert, and wander again is maybe, sounds aimless, but they continue to just live in that desert area for 40 years, as God says, because of your lack of faith, none of this generation is going to go into the promised land. Only the young will cross over. The older generation, because of their lack of faith, you're all going to die in the desert. And they do. So everybody who came out of Egypt, the adults primarily who came out of Egypt, they all die in the desert. It's their children and their grandchildren who then, after 40 years, do cross over. If you remember, Moses himself dies on the east side of the Jordan. He doesn't cross over. Joshua becomes the leader of the group. And Joshua and, the armies of Israel, they spend a lot of time conquering and occupying. And that book of Joshua is about that, starting with the Battle of Jericho, well known for the walls come a-tumbling down and all that. And then occupying Canaan. Then we get to the book of Judges, and we have this period where it's Joshua dies. He's been the leader. We haven't gotten to the book of Samuel yet, which is where Israel chooses its first king. Saul, who's not a good king. And then after Saul is David, and after him is Solomon, etc. That period in between Joshua and the first king is the period of the judges. And they were these leaders who arose when needed. So before we go to the Samson story, this would tell us about both Gideon and Samson. Go to Judges chapter 2. Judges chapter 2. And the book of Judges is right after Joshua. And right before Ruth that we looked at last time. So the book of Judges there, chapter 2. And looking at verse 10. And it's talking about, well, actually, go back up to verse 8. Judges 2:8. 2:8. Joshua, son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died at the age of 110. They buried him in the land of his inheritance at Timnath Heres in the hill country of Ephraim, north of Mount Gaash. Okay, so Joshua dies. Which, remember, just side note, Joshua is the same name as Jesus. They're both the Hebrew name Yeshua. When you go from Hebrew to English, Yeshua comes out Joshua. But the New Testament is written in Greek. And then the name Yeshua in Greek becomes Iesus. And then you go from Iesus to English and it becomes Jesus. But all of those are the same name. Joshua, Yeshua, Iesus, Jesus. They're all the same Hebrew name. Okay? So Jesus of Nazareth, Jesus Christ, has the same name as Joshua in the Old Testament. They're both Yeshua or Yeshua in Hebrew. So just a little side note there. And that's, we have anglicized versions of Hebrew names. You know, the names that we have in the Old Testament are not how they pronounce them. Solomon is Shlomo. Isaac is Yitzhak. Jacob is Jacob. I mean, that's the Hebrew pronunciation, and we have the anglicized version of those names. Moses is Moshe. So when you hear some of these people in history in Israel who have names like Moshe or Shlomo or Yitzhak or things like that, those are those names. They're just the Hebrew version, and we hear the English version. Or when we hear, if you go down to a country that speaks Spanish, it's, Jesus is Jesus. But it's still all the same name. Anyway, so Joshua dies. Then verse 10. After that whole generation had been gathered to their fathers, another generation grew up who knew neither the Lord nor what he had done for Israel. Then the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord and served the Baals. Remember, this is a generic name, really, for all of the fertility gods of the Canaanites. They forsook the Lord. And every time you see the word Lord like that, remember it's the word Yahweh, the name of God, of Israelites. They forsook Yahweh, the God of their fathers, who brought them out of Egypt. They followed and worshipped various gods of the peoples around them. They provoked the Lord to anger because they forsook him and served Baal and the Ashtaroths. These are, again, Canaanite gods. In his anger against Israel, the Lord handed them over to raiders who plundered them. He sold them to their enemies all around, whom they were no longer able to resist. Whenever Israel went out to fight, the hand of the Lord was against them to defeat them, just as he had sworn to them, and they were in great distress. Then the Lord raised up judges. And again, the word maybe would be better translated simply as leaders than the word judges. He raised up leaders. He raised up judges who saved them out of the hands of these raiders. Yet they wouldn't listen to their judges and prostituted themselves to other gods and worshiped them. Unlike their fathers, they quickly turned from the way in which their fathers had walked, the way of obedience to the Lord's commands. Whenever the Lord raised up a judge for them, he was with the judge and saved them out of the hands of their enemies as long as the judge lived. For the Lord had compassion on them as they groaned under those who oppressed and afflicted them. But then the judge died. The people returned to ways even more corrupt than those of their fathers, following other gods and serving and worshiping them. They refused to give up their evil practices and their stubborn ways. So this is this cycle that we're going to see all through the Old Testament. And even, again, once they do have a king, once the monarchy begins with Saul and then David and then Solomon, and then the divided monarchy when it splits into the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, all through the book of 1st and 2nd Kings and all of that, there's a cycle of the people of Israel and Judea. They turn away from God. They fall into worshiping foreign gods. That gets them into desperate trouble. They become desperate. They remember, oh, we're supposed to worship Yahweh or the Lord. They cry out to him. God brings them out of their oppression or misery or crisis. And for a little while, they're faithful. And then they fall into disobedience again. And the cycle just goes over and over and over. The cycle of disobedience, disaster. Oh, save us, Lord. God saves them. They're faithful for a little while. And then they drift back into disobedience. And it just happens over and over and over in the Old Testament. So the book of Judges is a series of stories of these leaders that are not kings. They're not really prophets. They're more, if anything, military leaders than anything. And the one that is probably the most entertaining is Samson. He's also a knucklehead. I mean, he's just not. He's not very righteous. He's not listening to God. His actions are often foolhardy. I mean, he is not a role model, really. Samson is not a role model by any reasonable way. God is able to use him in Israel's continual struggle with one of their enemies that we see them fighting over and over and over, which is the Philistines. The same Philistines that, Goliath during the time of David and other places. The Philistines are sort of a repetitive enemy of the Israelites all through the early parts of the Old Testament. I mean, they are, the Philistines are, this constant state of either Cold War or regular war with the people of Israel. So God raises up Samson to go against the Philistines. But the way he does it is often, the way that Samson goes about it is not anything to imitate often. So let's look at Samson's story, which is in chapter 13 of Judges. So chapter 13 of Judges. It just begins with one of these cycles. Again, the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord, so the Lord delivered them into the hands of the Philistines for 40 years. So the Philistines conquer the Israelites and are their overlords. They are controlling them. They are controlling the finances. They're controlling much about trade and everything else. The Philistines have won against the Israelites. Now, they haven't really made them slaves, but they are definitely have conquered the Israelites. A certain man of Zorah named Manoah from the clan of the Danites. Remember, Dan is one of the 12 sons of Jacob. By the way, Manoah his name means rest. Rest. So, a man named Manoah from the clan of the Danites had a wife who was sterile and remained childless. The angel of the Lord appeared to her and said, "You are sterile and childless, but you're going to conceive and have a son." Which is like, whoa, this almost sounds like a Christmas story here right at the beginning. But you're going to conceive and have a son. Now, see to it that you drink no wine or other fermented drink, and that you do not eat anything unclean, because you will conceive and give birth to a son. No razor may be used on his head, because the boy is to be a Nazirite, set apart to God from birth, and he will begin the deliverance of Israel from the hands of the Philistines. He is to be a Nazirite. Now, this is confusing again because we see the word Nazirite, and most of us think, oh, that must have something to do with the city of, or the town of Nazareth. No, it doesn't. They have the same root word. The root word in Hebrew, the NZR, the nuzzer part, is a Hebrew word that means vow. But you have to go back to the book of Numbers to understand what is a Nazirite. What is a Nazirite? So go back to Numbers 6. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers. Numbers 6. What is a Nazirite? Look at the first part of chapter 6. Numbers 6. The Lord said to Moses, "Speak to the Israelites and say to them, if a man or woman wants to make a special vow, a vow of separation to the Lord as a Nazirite, he must abstain from wine and other fermented drink, and must not drink vinegar made from wine or from other fermented drink. He must not drink grape juice or eat grapes or raisins. As long as he is a Nazirite, he must not eat anything that comes from the grapevine, not even the seeds or the skins. During the entire period of his vow of separation, no razor may be used on his head. He must be holy until the period of his separation to the Lord is over. He must let the hair of his head grow long. Throughout the period of his separation to the Lord, he must not go near a dead body. Even if his own father or mother or brother or sister dies, he must not make himself ceremonially unclean on account of them, because the symbol of his separation to God is on his head. Throughout the period of his separation, he is consecrated to the Lord." Now, I'm going to read the entire chapter. This says this is basically a vow that someone would take to have a special period. We would compare it to a period of fasting or abstinence, or I'm going to take a Nazirite vow, and for the duration of the vow, I'm not going to drink any fruit of the vine, I'm not going to shave, I'm not going to cut my hair, I'm not going to touch any dead bodies. I'm going to totally devote myself to worship of God. It's like I'm going to totally have a time of focus on the Lord. And then you have however many days of your Nazirite vow, and then you come to the end of it. You have the end, and look at verse 18. This is when he finishes. Well, actually, go back to 16. No, actually, go back to 13. I'm sorry, 6:13. Now, this is the law for the Nazirite when the period of separation is over. And he goes to the tent of meeting. He makes offerings, and it talks about an animal and grain offering and all that. 16, the priest is present before the Lord. He makes the offering. Then verse 18, he goes to the entrance of the tent of meeting. He must shave off the hair. He takes the hair, puts it in the fire. And then 19, after the Nazirite has shaved off the hair, the priest is to place in his hands a boiled shoulder of a ram and a cake and a wafer from the basket made without yeast. Then he waves them in front of the Lord. And then it says there at the end of verse 20, after that the Nazirite may drink wine. 21, this is the law of the Nazirite, who vows his offering to the Lord in accordance with his separation in addition to whatever else he can afford. He must fulfill the vow he's made according to the law of the Nazirite. So, if you want to read more of that, chapter 6. So this is, in most cases for the Jews, this was a voluntary time of extra dedication to the Lord that had a beginning and an end. And at the end, you'd shave your head and all this other stuff. But here, this angel tells Manoah and his wife, aren't given her name, you're going to have a baby, and he is going to be a Nazirite for life. Not just for a period. He's going to be a Nazirite for life. He's never to drink wine. He's never to cut his hair. And he's never to touch dead bodies. We're going to see he doesn't do very good at one of those. Okay? So, they tell the parents, your child is going to be a Nazarite. Verse 6, 13:6. I'm back in Judges now, 13:6. The woman went to her husband, and remember, the angel has appeared only to the woman here, to the wife, not to the husband. The angel has appeared just to the woman, which again is like, sounds almost like a Christmassy kind of story. The woman went to her husband, verse 6, and said, "A man of God came to me. He looked like an angel of God. Very awesome. I didn't ask him where he came from. He didn't tell me his name. But he said to me, 'You will conceive and give birth to a son. Now then, drink no wine or other fermented drink, and don't eat anything unclean, because the boy will be a Nazarite of God from birth until the day of his death.' Then Manoah prayed to the Lord, 'O Lord, I beg you, let the man of God you sent to us come again to teach us how to bring up this boy who's to be born.' God heard Manoah, and the angel of God came again to the woman while she was out in the field. But her husband was not with her. The woman hurried to tell her husband, 'He's here, the man who appeared to me the other day.' Manoah got up, followed his wife. When he came to the man, he said, 'Are you the one who talked to my wife?' 'I am.' Manoah asked him, 'When your words are fulfilled, what is to be the rule for the boy's life and work?' The angel of the Lord answered, 'Your wife must do all that I've told her. She must not eat anything that comes from the grapevine, nor drink any wine or other fermented drink, nor eat anything unclean. She must do everything I've commanded her.' Manoah said to the angel of the Lord, 'We'd like you to stay until we prepare a young goat for you. Please stay for dinner,' basically. Angel replied, 'Even though you detain me, I won't eat any of your food. But if you prepare a burnt offering, offer it to the Lord.' Manoah didn't realize it was the angel of the Lord. And Manoah inquired of the angel of the Lord, 'What is your name, so that we may honor you when your word comes true?' He replied, 'Why do you ask my name? It is beyond understanding.'" Which reminds me, the name of an angel is beyond understanding. This is the way my brain works. I seem to remember, maybe I dreamed this, maybe I do remember it. It seems like there's an episode of Star Trek where they ask Spock his full name, and he says, "Well, you wouldn't be able to pronounce it anyway." It's way above you. So he says, "My name is beyond understanding." Then Manoah took a young goat together with the grain offering, sacrificed it on the rock to the Lord. The Lord did an amazing thing while Manoah and his wife watched. As the flame blazed up from the altar toward heaven, the angel of the Lord ascended in the flame. And seeing this, Manoah and his wife fell with their face to the ground. When the angel of the Lord didn't show himself again to Manoah and his wife, Manoah realized that it was the angel of the Lord. "We're doomed to die," he said to his wife. "We've seen God." His wife answered, "If the Lord had meant to kill us, he would not have accepted a burnt offering and a grain offering from our hands, nor shown us all these things, or now told us this. Who seems to be the more reasonable person in this marriage?" We're not told her name. We're only told his name, but the angel talks to her, gives her all the instructions. He's like, "Oh, we're going to die." "No, we're not. Don't you realize if he was going to kill us, we'd already be dead?" She seems to be a lot more on track here than Manoah. But they've been told, and then it says, verse 24, the woman gave birth to a boy and named him Samson, which is Hebrew for sunny, as in the sun. Sunny. He grew up, and the Lord blessed him, and the Spirit of the Lord began to stir him while he was in Mahanadan, between Zorah and Eshtaol. Now that word, the Spirit of the Lord began to stir him. That word stir is hard to pronounce. The Spirit stirred him. A better translation almost might be agitate. The Spirit of the Lord began to agitate him, or even trouble him, or bother him. So this idea is stirring. And we're going to see that Samson is, as I said, knucklehead. You have to see for yourself if you haven't ever read much of the story outside of the famous scene with Delilah that we'll get to. But the stuff that goes before the Delilah part is, we'll just have to look at it. 14. Samson went down to Timnah and saw there a young Philistine woman. When he returned, he said to his father and mother, "I've seen a Philistine woman in Timnah. Now get her for me as a wife." Is there a red flag right off the bat? Are they supposed to be marrying the Philistines? No, they're not supposed to be marrying these pagan women with these pagan gods. They're not supposed to intermarry with the Philistines. But he goes down to where the Philistines live and sees a pretty face and says, "Yep, I want to marry her. Get her for me." Verse 3, his father and mother replied, "Isn't there an acceptable woman among your relatives or among all our people? Must you go to the uncircumcised Philistines to get a wife?" In other words, you need to marry a nice Jewish girl. Come on, I mean, this is nice. You should not be doing this. You need to marry a nice Jewish girl, not this Philistine. But Samson said to his father, "Get her for me. She's the right one for me." His parents didn't know that this was from the Lord, who was seeking an occasion to confront the Philistines, or again, provoke the Philistines. For at that time, they were ruling over Israel. So, in other words, this was all part of an idea to provoke the Philistines. Samson went down to Timnah together with his father and mother. As they approached the vineyards of Timnah, suddenly a young lion came roaring towards him. The Spirit of the Lord came upon him in power, so that he tore the lion apart with his bare hands, as he might have torn a young goat. But he told neither his father nor his mother what he had done. Then he went down and talked with the woman, and he liked her. Okay, this is the first indication that he is not your normal young man. He has super strength. He is a very, very early version of what we would normally think of as a superhuman. He has superhuman strength. He kills a lion with his bare hands. Sometime later, when he went back to marry her, he turned aside to look at the lion's carcass. In it was a swarm of bees and some honey, which he scooped out with his hands and ate as he went along. So bees have built a hive inside the carcass of the lion, and now there's honey. When he rejoined his parents, he gave them some, and they ate it too, but he didn't tell them that he'd taken the honey from the lion carcass. Now, his father went down to see the woman. And Samson made a feast there, as was customary for bridegrooms. When he appeared, he was given 30 companions. In other words, these would be the bachelor party, but it's not his friends, it's 30 Philistines. Okay? He's given 30 Philistines for this feast, this sort of bachelor party-esque feast. He's got 30 Philistine companions. "Let me tell you a riddle," Samson said to them. "If you can give me the answer within the 7 days of the feast," this is a week-long bachelor party, obviously, "I'll give you 30 linen garments and 30 sets of clothes. If you can't tell me the answer, you must give me 30 linen garments and 30 sets of clothes." So let's make this interesting as we're all drinking and whatever here. Let's have a little wager. See if you can solve my riddle. "Tell us the riddle," they said. "Let's hear it." In other words, they agreed to the bet. He replied, "Out of the eater, something to eat. Out of the strong, something sweet." Now, if I just totally out of the blue said, "Here's a riddle for you. Out of the eater, something to eat. Out of the strong, something sweet," would you immediately go, "Oh, it must be honey out of a lion carcass"? Is there any possible way you would solve that riddle? I mean, without knowing that he'd killed a lion, without knowing any of the surrounding information, if you just were told that riddle, it's not like, what has four wheels and flies, a garbage truck. I mean, it's not like that. It's not that kind of riddle. There's no possible way to know the answer to this riddle. So he gives them this riddle. For 3 days, they couldn't give an answer. Well, yeah, duh. On the fourth day, they said to Samson's wife, because remember, at this time, they haven't had the ceremony, but they're considered married, basically, at this point. Coax your husband into explaining the riddle for us, or we'll burn you and your father's household to death. So, that again escalates pretty quickly there. They don't want to have to pay him the 30 garments, so get your husband, get Samson to tell us the answer, or we will burn you and your entire family to death. Did you invite us here to rob us? We don't even know this guy. We're here at his bachelor party, and we foolishly agreed to this wager, and we can't figure out the answer to this stupid riddle. Then Samson's wife threw herself on him, sobbing, "You hate me. You don't really love me. You've given my people a riddle, but you haven't told me the answer." "I haven't even explained it to my father or mother," he replied. "So why would I explain it to you?" You can tell this marriage is off on a great start here. If I haven't told my parents, why would I even tell you? You're just my wife, She cried the whole 7 days of the feast. So on the seventh day, he finally told her. So she cries and begs and says, "You don't love me," for 7 days. The seventh day, he finally told her because she continued to press him. She in turn explained the riddle to her people. Before sunset on the seventh day, the men of the town said to him, "What is sweeter than honey? What is stronger than a lion?" And Samson said to them, "If you had not plowed with my heifer, you would not have solved my riddle." How do you read that? Well, it's more than disrespectful. What is he implying? Huh? Yes, he's implying that she slept with them. It is a crude way. And what a delightful way to refer to your wife. You plowed my heifer. Yeah. What a wonderful way to describe your bride. Yes, it is obviously an accusation that she has been sleeping with these men. Then the Spirit of the Lord came upon him in power. He went down to Ashkelon, which is a Philistine town, struck down 30 of their men, stripped them of their belongings, and gave their clothes to those who had explained the riddle. Well, I got to pay up, so I'm going to go kill 30 Philistines, strip them of their clothing so I can pay off the bet. Burning with anger, he went up to his father's house. And Samson's wife was given to the friend who had attended him at the wedding. So they take his wife and immediately marry her to the best man. So things are off to a jolly start here, as you can see in this relationship between Samson and the Philistines. So, later on, at the time of the wheat harvest, Samson took a young goat and went to visit his wife. Thinking, everything's peachy keen, everything's fine. He said, I'm going to my wife's room, but her father wouldn't let him go in. "I was so sure you thoroughly hated her," he said, "that I gave her to your friend." In other words, Samson doesn't realize that they've taken his wife now and married her off to the best man. And his quote-unquote father-in-law says, "Oh, well, after that comment you gave her about being the heifer and all that, I figured you hated her, so I married her off to your friend. Isn't her younger sister more attractive? Take her instead." So he offers up the younger sister as a substitute wife. Samson said to them, well, this time I have a right to get even with the Philistines. This is going to escalate quickly. I'll really harm them. So he went out and caught 300 foxes, and it's possible that the translation there of fox could alternately be translated jackal, which are more common. So either 300 foxes or 300 jackals. And tied them tail to tail in pairs. He then fastened a torch to every pair of tails, lit the torches, and let the foxes loose in the standing grain of the Philistines. So you've got 150 pairs of either foxes or jackals with their tails tied together, with a torch tied to them as well, running wild through their fields, burning up all their grain. He burned up the shocks of the standing grain together with the vineyards and the olive groves. So he burns up all their agriculture. When the Philistines asked, who did this? They were told, Samson, the Timnite's son-in-law, because his wife was given to his friend. In other words, why would Samson do this to us? Well, because they gave his Philistine wife to another man and instead didn't even let him know that was happening. So the owners of these vineyards, so the Philistines went up and burned her and her father to death. So yeah, everything is going so well at this point. Samson said to them, since you've acted like this, I won't stop until I get my revenge on you. Which seems like he's already gotten a pretty good measure of revenge at this point. I mean, he's pretty thirsty for vengeance at this point. He attacked them viciously, slaughtered many of them. Then he went down and stayed in a cave in the rock of Etam. I'll stop there for a minute. What? Have y'all read this story before and known about Samson's temperament and all of this? What is kind of interesting to me is a few years ago, the Sight and Sound Theater in Branson, where they do Janine and I have only been to one of those, and the one we went to was Samson. And none of this is in there. I mean, none of this was in the production. It was trying to turn him into more of a hero than maybe he really is. We're told at the beginning, this is basically, this guy is going to be a thorn in the side of the Philistines. The Philistines have conquered God's people, and so this guy it's like letting a bull loose in the china shop. I mean, this guy is going to be a disruptor. He's going to just plague the Philistines. He's a blunt force weapon against the Philistines. But he's not exactly a role model. I don't think we're to take him as a role model. So, notice what he has not done up to this point in the story. Has he ever prayed? Has he ever mentioned God? And what is, the Nazirite vow, don't drink wine. We're not told specifically if he ever drank wine. Don't cut your hair. Okay, we know he hasn't cut his hair because that's a big part of the story. Don't go near dead bodies. Well, he definitely has not lived up to that. Because if you murder 30 people, you're pretty much close to dead bodies. So he hasn't been doing that part of the Nazirite vow about staying away from dead bodies. So he goes off and lives in a cave, or stays in a cave after he has now killed even more men. So the Philistines, 15:9, the Philistines went up and camped in Judah, spreading out near Lehi. The men of Judah asked, why have you come to fight us? Because this is obviously sowing more problems between the Philistines and the Israelites. This wild man who is doing all these vicious things to the Philistines. So the Philistines go to the men of Judah, and why are you coming for us? The next verse. We've come to take Samson prisoner, they answered, to do to him as he did to us. In other words, we're not here to kill you. The Philistines say to the Israelite men, we're not here to kill you. We just want Samson. Just turn over Samson to us. He's the problem. Just turn him over to us. Then 3,000 men from Judah went down to the cave in the rock of Etam and said to Samson, so they go to the Israelites now, men from the tribe of Judah, go to find Samson, 3,000 of them. Don't you realize that the Philistines are rulers over us? What have you done to us? He answered, I merely did to them what they did to me. And they said to him, we've come to tie you up and hand you over to the Philistines. Okay? Rather than continue to provoke them and have them attack us, we're going to turn you over to the Philistines. Samson said, swear to me that you won't kill me yourself. He's like, okay, you can tie me up. You can turn me over just as long as you don't kill me. Agreed, they answered. We'll only tie you up and hand you over to them. We won't kill you. So they bound him with 2 new ropes and led him up from the rock. As he approached Lehi, the Philistines came toward him shouting. And again, the word shouting there is more like a battle cry. Like, a real... The Spirit of the Lord came upon him in power. The ropes on his arms became like charred flax, and the bindings dropped from his hands. Finding a fresh jawbone of a donkey, he grabbed it and struck down 1,000 men. So, using the jawbone of a donkey as a weapon, he starts, it's like Wolverine, I guess. It's just like slice and dice. He's just chopping them down with the jawbone of a donkey. And Samson said, with a donkey's jawbone, I made donkeys of them. And of course, in the King James, it's the jawbone of an ass. So with the jawbone of an ass, I've made asses of them, is what it reads in the King James. With a donkey's jawbone, I've killed 1,000 men. When he finished speaking, he threw away the jawbone, and the place was called Ramath Lehi, which means Jawbone Hill, which is an appropriate name for the place, Jawbone Hill. Because he was very thirsty, he cried out to the Lord, you've given your servant this great victory. Must I now die of thirst and fall into the hands of the uncircumcised? God opened up the hollow place in Lehi, and water came out of it, and Samson drank, and his strength returned, and he revived, and the spring was called En Hakore, which means Caller's Spring. Samson led Israel for 20 years in the days of the Philistines. Now, notice the word led there is, more like he continued to be, just as I said, a brute force against the Philistines, a continual thorn in their side, a continual terrorist to the Philistines. Would maybe be, from their perspective, this guy is unstoppable. He is a brute with strength beyond understanding. And he is a continual, the Philistines, every time they think they're going to get him, they don't get him. Now, we come to probably the more famous part of the story. Most people, if they only know one part of this story, this is the part of the story they know. One day, Samson went to Gaza, where he saw a prostitute. He went in to spend the night with her. And the people of Gaza were told, Samson's here. So again, this is Philistine territory, Gaza. When you read some of these things, you realize, these are real places that are in the news now. These are not, sometimes when you read the Bible, the names all sound so foreign. It's almost like you're reading about Narnia or, something in Lord of the Rings or something. No, we know now where Gaza is. At least I hope we do. They said that some of the people who were most protesting about what's happening in Gaza, they said, can you show us where Gaza is on a map? And they couldn't find it on a map. But hopefully we could all find Gaza on a map. The people of Gaza were told, Samson's here. So they surrounded the place and lay in wait for him all night in the city gate. They made no move during the night, saying, at dawn we'll kill him. Again, this is the role model again, the whole thing about he went into a prostitute, that was not in the Sight and Sound production about him going into the prostitute. But Samson lay there only until the middle of the night. He got up and took hold of the doors of the city gate, which are not like this. The doors of the city gate are like, it's seen in movies, old movies. A city gate doors are going to be at least 10 feet tall and, 8 feet wide. Made of thick wood. We're talking about a city gate walls. We're talking about massive pieces of wood. Because what happens next, it says, he got up and took hold of the doors with the two posts, tore them loose, bar and all, and lifted them to his shoulders and carried them to the top of the hill that faces Hebron. If we just are picturing, he tore off a couple of doors and carried them, we go, it'd be kind of hard, but it wouldn't be. No, this is, again, a feat of superhuman strength to carry city gates like that. We're talking something that would weigh, hundreds and hundreds of pounds, maybe a ton of that we're talking about, carrying gates like that. Sometime, and that's just its own little episode. Those 16:1 through 3, that's its own separate episode. Before we get to now the more well-known episode, 16 starting at verse 4. Sometime later, he fell in love with a woman in the valley of Sorek, whose name was Delilah. Notice the other women in this story. Do we know his mother's name? No. Do we know his first wife's name? No. Do we know the name of this prostitute? No. But Delilah, we know her name. Delilah means delicate. That's what the name Delilah means. It means delicate. Now let me pause there for just a second as we get ready to read the story of Samson and Delilah. Because, in all of the literature of Israel, what's going through people's minds as they hear this story. Because remember, this like every Old Testament story, before it was ever written down, it was told orally around campfires, around family meals. It was told, and this is a good story. This is it's not about a person who's very, but in terms of it's an exciting story about Samson, this brute, this superhuman, incredible Hulk, who's wreaking havoc over the hated Philistines. This is a good story. It's an entertaining story that's told over and over. But when you think about the people of Israel and all the various kinds of literature that are a part of that, go over to the book of Proverbs for a minute. And again, the book of Proverbs may not be one of the books that we spend a whole lot of time on. But some of the focus of the book of Proverbs, the Proverbs were often, father to son primarily. The Proverbs were often meant, this is the teaching of the father to the son in the book of Proverbs. So look at Proverbs chapter 7. Proverbs chapter 7. My son, Father to son. My son, keep my words and store up my commands within you. Keep my commands and you will live. Guard my teachings as the apple of your eye. If you ever wondered where that phrase came from, that's where that comes from, the apple of your eye, which is like what we would call the very center, of your eye, the apple of your eye. Bind them on your fingers, write them on the tablet of your heart. Say to wisdom, you are my sister, and call understanding your kinsman. They will keep you from the adulteress, from the wayward wife with her seductive words. At the window of my house, I looked out through the lattice. I saw among the simple, I noticed among the young men a youth who lacked judgment. He was going down the street near her corner, walking along in the direction of her house. At twilight, as the day was fading, as the dark of night set in, then out came a woman to meet him, dressed like a prostitute and with crafty intent. She is loud and defiant. Her feet never stay at home. Now in the street, now in the squares, at every corner she lurks. She took hold of him and kissed him, and with a brazen face she said, I have fulfilled offerings at home. Today I fulfilled my vows. So I came out to meet you. I looked for you and have found you. I've covered my bed with colored linens from Egypt. I've perfumed my bed with myrrh, aloes, and cinnamon. Come, let's drink deep of love till morning. Let's enjoy ourselves with love. My husband is not at home. He has gone on a long journey. He took his purse filled with money and will not be home till full moon. With persuasive words, she led him astray. She seduced him with her smooth talk. All at once he followed her, like an ox going to the slaughter, like a deer stepping into a noose, till an arrow pierces his liver, like a bird darting into a snare, little knowing it will cost him his life. Now then, my sons, listen to me. Pay attention to what I say. Do not let your heart turn to her ways or stray from her into her paths. Many are the victims she has brought down. Her slain are a mighty throng. Her house is a highway to the grave, leading down to the chambers of death. So this is in the book of Proverbs, telling the young men, watch out for the seducer. Watch out for the woman who will seduce you and lead you down the primrose path, lead you to destruction, lead you to death. Now, think about that proverb being in the minds of Israelites. And now they're introduced. Samson meets Delilah. Samson meets Delilah. Delicate. And we read about the relationship between Samson and Delilah. But keep this proverb and proverbs like it in the back of your mind. This is part of the culture. This is part of the warnings against young men, telling them to beware, beware, beware. Okay, so he meets. Verse 4, sometime later, he fell in love with a woman in the valley of Sorek whose name was Delilah. The valley of Sorek is Philistine territory, so we're to assume that Delilah is a Philistine woman, like his first wife was. The rulers of the Philistines went to her and said, see if you can lure him into showing you the secret of his great strength and how we can overpower him so we may tie him up and subdue him. Each one of us will give you 1,100 shekels of silver. So Delilah said to Samson, tell me the secret of your great strength and how you can be tied up and subdued. Samson answered her, if anyone ties me with 7 fresh thongs that have not been dried, I'll become as weak as any other man. Then the rulers of the Philistines brought her 7 fresh thongs that had not been dried, and she tied him with them. With men hidden in the room, she called him, Samson, the Philistines are upon you. But he snapped the thongs as easily as a piece of string snaps when it comes close to a flame. So the secret of his strength was not discovered. And again, you might want to say, well, is he suspicious at all at this point about her wanting to know how can I tie you up and that you won't be able to get loose? And maybe leave that there. But I mean, you think maybe is any kind of alarm bell going off in his head at this point? So, well, then it happens again. Then Delilah said to Samson, "You've made a fool of me. You lied to me. Come now, tell me how you can be tied." He said, "If anyone ties me securely with new ropes that have never been used, I'll become as weak as any other man." So Delilah took new ropes and tied him with them. Then with men hidden in the room, she called him, "Samson, the Philistines are upon you." But he snapped the ropes off his arms as if they were threads. Okay, now twice, it's like, there really ought to be some sort of suspicion growing in him. Why is she so insistent on knowing how I can be tied up? Delilah said to Samson, "Until now you've been making a fool of me and lying to me. Tell me how you can be tied." He replied, "If you weave the 7 braids of my head into the fabric on the loom and tighten it with the pin, I'll become as weak as any other man." So while he was sleeping, Delilah took the 7 braids of his head, wove them into the fabric, and tightened it with the pin. Again she called him, "Samson, the Philistines are upon you." He awoke from his sleep, pulled up the pin and the loom with the fabric. So, all right, 3 times he has told her a lie. He has lied to her. And 3 times, she has said, "Oh, the Philistines are coming." And he breaks it as easily as if it was just thread. And then here she says, verse 15, she said to him, "How can you say I love you when you won't confide in me? This is the 3rd time you've made a fool of me and haven't told me the secret of your great strength." With such nagging, she prodded him day after day until he was tired to death. So, 1,000 men could not conquer him, but nagging finally did. Finally, she wore him down. She wore him down until he was tired to death. So he told her everything. "No razor has ever been used on my head," he said, "because I have been a Nazirite, set apart to God since birth." Not a very good one. "If my head were shaved, my strength would leave me, and I would become as weak as any other man." When Delilah saw that he had told her everything, she can tell this is the truth. She can tell the other things he was just messing with her. But now she can tell this is the truth. She sent word to the rulers of the Philistines, "Come back once more. He has told me everything." So the rulers of the Philistines returned with the silver in their hands. Having put him to sleep on her lap, she called a man to shave off the 7 braids of his hair, and so began to subdue him, and his strength left him. So, the secret of his strength was his hair. Really, his Nazirite vow. That was the hair being the symbol of the vow. And now, the razor on his head, that was his kryptonite. That was the thing that robbed him of his strength. And she called, "Samson, the Philistines are upon you." He awoke from this sleep and thought, "I'll go out as before and shake myself free." But he did not know that the Lord had left him. Again, we say, "No, wait a minute, okay." And so much of the time when we read something like, we're like, "No, I need more explanation of that." As to is at that point, is God particularly upset with him at that moment, as opposed to these other things that he's done? That now he has broken the Nazirite vow with having his head shaved. So, verse 21, the Philistines seized him, gouged out his eyes, and took him down to Gaza. Binding him with bronze shackles, they set him to grinding in the prison. Now, do you know what I mean by grinding there? Have you ever seen like when they would grind, grain, to remove the chaff, and there would be a grinding, like a wheel, a stone wheel, and it would have, a bar coming out from the wheel, and you go around in a circle and it grinds the grain. And sometimes it's done with an animal walking in circles to grind the grain. But in this case, Samson is blinded, shackled to the mill, grinding grain for the Philistines. So that's what they've now made him a workhorse. They set him to grinding in the prison. But verse 22, but the hair on his head began to grow again after it had been shaved. And this, if you're making this as a movie, as you're picturing him, he's bald, he's grinding the thing, and the camera moves in, and you see, wait a minute, there's hair growing. There's little bits of hair growing on his head again. And you're like, it's like, again, because it's me, it's like Superman when the kryptonite has been removed and the sun is shining and his powers are coming back and the hair is growing. And you say, if his hair starts growing again, that means his strength is going to return. Now, the rulers of the Philistines, verse 23, the rulers of the Philistines assembled to offer a great sacrifice to Dagon, their god, and to celebrate, saying, our God has delivered Samson, our enemy, into our hands. Dagon, again, one of the Philistine gods, one of the Canaanite gods. And what we know from excavation and other sources is, Dagon is one of these awful pagan gods that demanded human sacrifice and children being burned alive and all kinds of horrible things that they used in the ritual sacrifice of this god Dagon. And when the people saw him, they praised their God, saying, our God, in other words, this is Dagon, our God has delivered our enemy into our hands, the one who laid waste our land and multiplied our slain. So it says they were in high spirits because finally, the thorn in their side, the one who has been for 20 years, we're told. For 20 years, he has been the one continually causing problems for the Philistines. Finally, after 20 years, they've got him. They called Samson out of the prison, and he performed for them. And again, we're not really told what that means. Performed, I assume they tortured him, would be my guess, in front of the crowd. They probably figured out ways to humiliate him, to beat him, to whip him, we're not really told the details about how he performed for them. But they bring him out so that they can enjoy seeing their enemy humiliated and beaten and blinded and etc. When they stood him among the pillars, Samson said to the servant who held his hand, put me where I can feel the pillars that support the temple, that I can lean against them. He's been whooped and he's been everything else. Let me at least lean against something. And he leans against the pillars. Now the temple was crowded with men and women. All the rulers of the Philistines were there, and on the roof there was about 3,000 men and women watching Samson perform. This is not just a little bitty, church or temple. This is a big, massive structure. Then Samson prayed to the Lord. For the first time, at least the first time in the story, he prays. For the first time, Samson actually prays. O sovereign Lord, remember me, O God. Please strengthen me just once more. Let me with one blow get revenge on the Philistines for my 2 eyes. And Samson reached towards the 2 central pillars on which the temple stood, bracing himself against them, his right hand on the one and his left hand on the other. Samson said, "Let me die with the Philistines." Then he pushed with all his might, and down came the temple on the rulers and all the people in it. Thus he killed many more when he died than when he lived. Then his brothers and his father's whole family went down to get him, and they brought him back and buried him between Zorah and Eshtaol in the tomb of Manoah his father. He had led Israel 20 years. So that 13, 14, 15, 16, those 4 chapters of the book of Judges, that is the saga of Samson. So now, having gone through more than just the Delilah part, what do you think about Samson? Yeah, not the brightest guy in the world. No, not the smartest. He's no Solomon, is he? He's not a Solomon by any means. No. As I say, you know, and I don't, believe me, this is a question that I don't have a definitive answer to, but as I say, this is a very entertaining story in a sort of a violent way, the same way an action movie is entertaining, even with lots of bloodshed and violence. It's an entertaining story in many ways, and it has a satisfying ending with, at the end, even though he's been weakened and et cetera, that he finally has the last laugh, in a way, over the enemy. But, so it's an entertaining story. But if we try to see it in the context of the saga of the people of Israel and their struggles and their disobedience and how God would send judges, leaders to help them fight against the enemies, and that this cycle of violence, and they win, they lose, they turn away from God, they call out to God, God sends somebody to help them in their struggle. I mean, in the larger fabric of the whole saga of, how does Samson fit into this whole thing?
I learned from the very beginning, I was disappointed in this, about halfway through, I thought, what is it? I don't know why I was included. But
yeah, and as I say, it's not like I have, well, here's the answer to that question. I think, if you have to go back to maybe the first part of it, where he first meets the first wife, and it says, when he, in 14:3, when he demands of his parents that they get him a Philistine wife, and it says his parents didn't know that this was from the Lord, who was seeking an occasion to confront the Philistines. In other words, I see him as a blunt force weapon against the Philistines. A way to continually keep them off balance in this ongoing struggle of the people of Israel against the Philistines and their enemies. But so he's a weapon, but he's not a hero. He's not a role model, definitely. He's not somebody to say, here's someone to follow his example. He is, at best, I'd say he's used to be a thorn in the side of Israel's enemies. But
he's very big on revenge.
Yeah, he does seem very big on revenge.
Does he have kind of a redemption arc when he realizes that when he breaks his vow by his hair being taken off, he realizes that his strength did come from God?
Yeah, I would hope maybe you can at least see it that way. Because it's the only time he prays. It's the only time he seems to actually seek God. The rest of the time when he does these feats of strength, tears apart the lion, he defeats the 1,000 men with the jawbone, he, does all these mighty acts. There's no thanks to God, there's no praise for God, there's no anything about God in any of that. It's only when he's totally brought low, that he finally prays. Only when he's at his absolute weakest and lowest, blinded, humiliated, that he finally seeks God. But you're right, he seeks God for vengeance. Yeah.
It seems like the kind of passage that probably has been used or would be used to justify, violence for God's will. How do you, how do you square that, I guess? What's the intention in leaving this time, I guess, is the goal just to protect Israel?
Yeah. Well, I think that it gives us insight into the ancient cycle of revenge and violence that we've seen in the Middle East for 3,000 years or more.
What's going on right now, and if you're in that area, and this long ago, it's being taught, that we, as the people of God, the Jewish people, have to protect this area, and it's okay to,
Right. Well, that's why we, on this side of the cross, on this side of Jesus, on this side of the empty tomb, and you read what Jesus teaches and how it compares to this, and you go to the Sermon on the Mount, and Jesus says things like, "You have heard it said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, love your enemies, turn the other cheek, go the extra mile, pray for those who persecute you," etc. And I'm not slamming our Jewish friends, because many of our Jewish friends would not prescribe or ascribe to a cycle of violence and revenge. But I think it does show that when Jesus comes along and says, when he says, "You have heard it said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth," he's quoting the Old Testament. I mean, that is in the Old Testament, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. He says, "You've heard that, but I say, love your enemy, pray for those who persecute you, if the enemy slaps you on one side, turn the other cheek. If the Roman soldier forces you to carry his pack for a mile, carry it for two, go the extra mile," etc., etc. This Jesus ethic of how you treat your enemy is very different from what we read about in especially the earlier parts of the Old Testament, where it is very much a cycle of violence. Now, how and you have to, at least I would say, the early Israelites' conception of God is not as clear as Jesus makes it. Jesus gives us a much clearer understanding of God than these people really had of God. I think that cycle of revenge is not the heart of God. I think the revelation of Jesus, he comes right out and basically says, well, it says this in the Old Testament, but I'm telling you something different. But I think when we read about the news and we read about this, because there's a cycle of revenge in that part of the world. I mean, we read about, the horrendous attack of October 6th. Well, then there's retaliation, and then Iran does something, and then Israel retaliates against Iran, and then Lebanon, and retaliation. Now, I think Israel, because Israel is really a Western nation transplanted in the middle of the Middle East. I mean, Israel has much more of a European feel to it than all the countries that surround it. So I think that there's many more guardrails around Israel than there are around Iran. Because as much as Judaism may not have the Jesus ethic, Iran has an Islamic ethic, a radical Islamic ethic that is really even more vicious and even more bloodthirsty and even more, they were talking about how in the mosques in Tehran, in the middle of the mosque service, the people are chanting, death to Israel, death to America, death, death, death. I mean, I can't imagine even in a synagogue that they're chanting death, death, death. I mean, and we certainly can't imagine that in a church, yeah.
It kind of makes sense then, and I might not get this all right, but it's Abraham, the Muslim faith.
Right.
And it all stems from like Abraham, it's just gone all these different ways.
Right.
That they're like hung up on whatever their stories of this early Old Testament have been. That teaches that way of being, the violence, even right here, without the Jesus ethic,
As I'm talking, the Jesus ethic, the Sermon on the Mount ethic, the Christian ethic of showing mercy and forgiveness to even those who persecute you, even those you consider enemies. The Jesus ethic is you don't have to like them, but you still have to treat them with love. Love meaning not an emotion, but a way of treating somebody. And that is unique to Christianity, even of the three, what we call the three Abrahamic faiths. The three Abrahamic faiths of Judaism, Islam, and Christianity all look to Abraham as their patriarch. I mean, that's why we just talk about Father Abraham. But our Muslim friends, as you say, they look at Ishmael's line instead of Isaac's line. As a matter of fact, the reason, having been to Israel now a couple of times, brings it all even more home. That the Dome of the Rock Mosque is right on the site of where the Jewish temple used to be. And the Dome of the Rock with the golden dome is right there, right there next to the Wailing Wall. They're just, 100 yards apart from each other. And why is the Dome of the Rock Mosque one of the three most holy sites in Islam? The most holy one, of course, is Mecca in Saudi Arabia. But the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem is one of the top three holy sites of Islam. What makes it so holy? Because according to the Quran, it was on that site that Abraham almost sacrificed Ishmael. See, in the book of Genesis, in the Hebrew Bible and in our Bible, the story is that Abraham almost sacrificed Isaac. At the last minute, God said, no, don't do it. Don't sacrifice. It just was a test to see if he would be totally obedient. And instead of sacrificing Isaac, there's a ram caught in the bush, and Abraham sacrifices the ram instead of his son Isaac. And that is in the Quran, it's not Isaac, it's Ishmael. And that story is told as it was God told him, take your son Ishmael and sacrifice him. And at the last minute, God says, no, don't do it. And where was the spot that happened? On the spot of the temple and the Dome of the Rock Mosque. And that's what makes that site holy. And that's why the fight over that tiny piece of real estate has been a source of bloodshed and hatred and violence for literally centuries, millennia. And and we, as I've said before, there's so many things for us to try to understand, and you can't know about everything, but most of us in the West, we don't really know the history that goes back thousands of years in that part of the world. And all the different empires and who's controlled that piece of land across the centuries, we're talking the Ottoman Empire, and all these things. And it always goes back to right now, Gaza. or the West Bank. Who owns this land? Whose land is this? You know, who did God give this land to? You know, and the people who are Muslim and the people who are Jewish have very different answers to that question about who does it really, really, really belong to. And, you know, it's the heart of centuries and centuries and centuries of bloodshed and vengeance. And there is, in some of these stories, in the early parts of the Old Testament, there is a cycle of violence. And I tend to think that my understanding is, and not everybody would share this, and they don't have to, is that the people who are witness to that, their understanding of God was not as fully formed as the one we have through Christ. That our understanding of who God is and the heart of God is brought to full understanding with Jesus. Because some people think, well, the Old Testament God is mean and the New Testament God is loving. No, it's the same God. You know, the God of the Old Testament is the God of Jesus. It's just that I think some of the people in the Old Testament who, they didn't quite grasp the heart of God the way that Jesus revealed to us. Does that make sense? That Jesus' revelation of the heart of the Father, the heart of Christ, the heart of God, the one he calls Abba, the Father God, is a deeper and fuller understanding of who God is that some of these writings in the Old Testament, because you can see in the Psalms, for example, the Psalms that we read, we don't read some of the Psalms that are crying out for vengeance. You know, the worst example, and I can't quote the Psalm number and verse, but one of the Psalms is praising God, and in the middle of the Psalm it says, "Oh Lord, how I hate my enemies, how much I hate those. I wish I could take their babies and crush their skulls against the rocks." And you're like, that's in the Bible? Yeah, it is. The idea of taking a baby and crushing its head against the rocks is part of a psalm? Yeah, it is. Because it is somebody who has been attacked by the enemy, and their vengeance and their bloodlust is crying out for justice or revenge, which depending on what side of the equation you're on. And you see that coming out in the psalmist's agony and desire for justice. Does God ever want to see a baby's head crushed against a rock? I would say no. God is never the will of God to take a baby and murder it. But that is the cry of the psalmist who is crying out, why have I been wronged and persecuted and my people have been killed? I want justice. And so when you read some of those, are called the deprecatory psalms, where the psalmist is crying out for vengeance against the enemy. And that's because the Psalms are the songs of the people. And sometimes the people were so oppressed and so downtrodden and so, persecuted that they cry out for justice. And their cry for justice sounds like a cry for vengeance. So that's way off of how far off topic that is about Samson. But yeah.
Go back to plowing my hair thing. Let me throw another idea. Plowing will be a plow that digs up dirt. And the reference to heifer is not necessarily a cow or a cow who hasn't had a child or hasn't had yet. But the relationship between Samson and his wife still at a pure state, that he trusted her enough that he gave her the answer. Well, they haven't had an argument or anything yet, and so they still had a sort of pure marriage, or almost. So when the Philistines went and started trying to dig up dirt on him and enticed her to tell him the answer, well, now she broke his trust between the two.
Whether his, yeah. Right. And his accusation doesn't necessarily mean even his accusation is true. I'm kind of leaning on, people who understand the original Hebrew a whole lot better than I do. And they said it's clearly a body reference or a reference of her doing something illicit. But just because he made the accusation doesn't mean that it was true. You know, he jumps to that conclusion maybe, but his relationship with women is not his strong suit in this at all. Of the women that he encounters, and I say that's why I brought up the proverb about watch out for the wicked woman, which was a part of that Hebrew culture, telling the young man, don't get drawn in. Now, of course, that's a very patriarchal approach, that it's the wicked woman luring the young man into her clutches. That's not how we would see that today. But that, in these proverbs that are passed from father to son, that's how they're trying to say, stay away from the woman who wants to lead you astray into adultery, into something illicit. We've covered all kinds of things. Is that, and yes.
You might look at Samson when he has lost all of his strength, and then he turns
To God.
This is like post-cross.
Yeah.
But you could look at it as though, okay, I've lost all my strength, and now I know where my strength comes from. I mean, that's one of the redeeming qualities.
Yeah, if there's anything redeeming, although he wants his strength back so he can get vengeance. I mean, that's what that's what kind of. I mean, when you think of the person who's lost everything and they finally turn to God, we think, okay, that's a redemption story. But what makes it a little hard to see as a redemption story is, give me my strength so I can seek vengeance against these people. It kind of turns it a little bit different way. But if you kind of just see it as, it's not sometimes until we have lost control that people finally turn to God. I mean, if you try to say, is there a moral to the story that we could pull out of Samson, who's I say, as a knucklehead? One of the morals of the story is, sometimes you have to lose everything before you're willing to turn to God. Sometimes you have to be brought low before you realize you're not in control. that your strength is not sufficient to solve all the problems. That you need something beyond physical strength or whatever, of course, they, again, given my interest, some people say Samson is the first superhero, that eventually all the American superheroes, an archetype of this man with superhuman strength. Other cultures besides Judaism have, people who had superhuman strength. I mean, the most obvious to us would be like Hercules, etc. Is a similar kind of character.
I was thinking of Superman, but hey, what?
Yeah, well, as I say, Hercules and Samson precede Superman by a few centuries. But of course, Superman, again, my nerd coming out, Superman is invented by two Jewish boys in Cleveland, Ohio. Two young Jewish boys, 17-year-old boys in Cleveland, Ohio, invent Superman. And Superman, in the very earliest Superman stories, which were in the 1930s, late 30s, still in the middle of the Depression, the first few Superman stories, he is fighting against not super villains. He's fighting against crooked politicians and people who are cheating the poor. I mean, he's kind of a Depression era fight for the common man character in those first couple of years before they bring in, Lex Luthor and that kind of stuff. So anyway, but why don't we pray? So let's pray. Lord, in so many ways, we realize that no one in the Scriptures is perfect except Jesus. No one sees you clearly, really, except for Jesus. No one gives us insight into who you are and who we're called to be except Jesus. So we read these stories and we realize the children of Abraham had so many ups and downs, and just like we do. And we help us to learn from sometimes even their mistakes, and help us to listen for the word of Christ in all we do, that he would be our guide, our light, and our Lord. We pray in his blessed name. Amen. All right, next week I'm going to talk about somebody who's a little bit more of a role model, Gideon, although he has his own issues of skepticism, but he's definitely a lot better example than Samson. Gideon he's got a lot, probably more positives than Samson does.